The morning sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds of Marcus Chen's corner office as he stared at the resignation letter on his desk. 3 years ago, he would have pleaded with the departing employee, offered raises, made promises he couldn't keep. Today, he simply nodded and accepted it with an unsettling calm that surprised even him. The transformation had been so gradual, so subtle, that he barely recognized the man he had become. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in the turbulent landscape of 16th-century Italy, understood something fundamental about human nature that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The weak are consumed by the strong, not through malice, but through the natural order of power dynamics. His observations, crystallized in The Prince and his other works, weren't instructions for cruelty, they were clinical examinations of how power actually operates in the real world, stripped of romantic idealism and moral platitudes. The concept of the dangerous man that Machiavelli described isn't about physical intimidation or overt aggression. It's about a fundamental shift in consciousness, a metamorphosis from reactive victim to strategic actor. This transformation manifests in 7 distinct signs, each representing a crucial element in the development of what Machiavelli would recognize as true personal sovereignty. Marcus had unconsciously begun exhibiting these signs 18 months earlier, following a corporate restructuring that had nearly destroyed his career. His naive trust in company loyalty and fair play had left him exposed when budget cuts demanded sacrifices. He watched colleagues who had mastered the art of political positioning emerge unscathed while those who relied solely on merit and hard work found themselves discarded. The lesson was harsh but clear: good intentions and exceptional performance meant nothing without strategic awareness. The first sign, emotional detachment from outcomes. The most fundamental transformation in becoming what Machiavelli would term dangerous is the development of emotional detachment from specific outcomes. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or callous, quite the opposite. It means developing the ability to remain strategically flexible regardless of immediate emotional reactions to events. Marcus remembered the exact moment this shift began. During a quarterly review meeting, his direct supervisor had publicly criticized a project Marcus had spent months perfecting. The old Marcus would have felt personally attacked, would have argued defensively, would have let the criticism affect his judgment for weeks. Instead, he found himself observing the situation with curious detachment. Why was his supervisor attacking him publicly rather than privately? What was the political context? Who benefited from his apparent failure? This emotional distance allowed him to see the criticism for what it actually was, a calculated move by his supervisor to deflect attention from his own departmental shortcomings. Rather than react emotionally, Marcus quietly documented the interaction, began building alliances with colleagues who had witnessed the unfair treatment, and strategically repositioned himself over the following months. The supervisor, expecting defensive reactions that would justify further attacks, instead found himself dealing with an opponent who had become unpredictably calm and strategically minded. Machiavelli understood that emotional attachment to specific outcomes creates predictability, and predictability creates vulnerability. When someone knows exactly how you'll react to pressure, they can manipulate those reactions to their advantage. The dangerous man, however, maintains enough emotional distance to evaluate each situation based on strategic merit rather than emotional impulse. This detachment extends beyond workplace dynamics to all areas of life. In relationships, it means caring deeply about people while not being emotionally devastated when specific relationships end or change. In financial matters, it means pursuing prosperity without becoming psychologically dependent on particular investments or opportunities. In personal goals, it means working intensely toward objectives while remaining flexible enough to pivot when circumstances change. The development of this emotional detachment requires constant practice and self-awareness. It begins with recognizing the difference between caring about something and being emotionally attached to a specific outcome. Marcus learned to invest his energy and attention fully while maintaining the psychological flexibility to adapt when results didn't match expectations. The second sign, strategic thinking over reactive responses. The second transformation involves replacing instinctive reactions with calculated responses. Most people operate in a reactive mode, responding immediately to stimuli based on emotional impulses or social conditioning. The dangerous man, in Machiavelli's conception, develops the habit of strategic evaluation before action. This shift became apparent to Marcus during a particularly challenging period when a younger colleague began actively undermining his projects. The colleague, fresh from business school and eager to advance quickly, had begun a systematic campaign of subtle sabotage, taking credit for Marcus's ideas in meetings, questioning his competence in front of senior management, and building alliances against him among newer employees. The old Marcus would have either confronted the colleague directly, creating an obvious conflict that would have reflected poorly on both of them, or suffered in silence while hoping justice would eventually prevail. Neither approach would have been strategically sound. Instead, Marcus began thinking several moves ahead, like a chess player analyzing multiple possible futures before selecting the optimal response. He started by gathering information. He quietly investigated his colleague's background, identified his ambitions and insecurities, and mapped his alliance network within the company. He discovered that the young man had a pattern of this behavior at his previous company, where he had eventually been transferred after creating too much interpersonal conflict. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus began a careful campaign of strategic positioning. Rather than defending against accusations, he began proactively building stronger relationships with key decision-makers. Instead of trying to expose his colleague's sabotage directly, he created situations where the colleague would either have to demonstrate actual competence or reveal his duplicitous nature to others. Most importantly, he documented everything meticulously, creating a detailed record of projects, communications, and outcomes that would speak for itself when the inevitable reckoning arrived. The strategic approach required patience and emotional discipline, but it proved devastatingly effective. Within 6 months, the colleague's lack of substantial contributions became obvious to management, while Marcus's steady competence and professional behavior had earned him increased respect and responsibility. The colleague was eventually reassigned to a lower-impact role, not through any direct action by Marcus, but as a natural consequence of his own unsustainable tactics. Machiavelli emphasized that the prince who survives is the one who thinks systematically about consequences and probabilities rather than acting on immediate impulses. This principle applies equally to personal and professional situations. Strategic thinking involves asking questions like, what are all possible outcomes of this action? Who benefits from each potential result? What are the long-term implications beyond the immediate situation? How does this action align with my broader objectives? The development of strategic thinking requires cultivating patience, gathering comprehensive information before making decisions, and always considering multiple possible futures. It means resisting the immediate gratification of emotional responses in favor of actions that serve long-term interests. The third sign, calculated risk assessment. The third sign of Machiavellian transformation is the development of sophisticated risk assessment capabilities. Most people either avoid all risks out of fear or take reckless chances without proper evaluation. The dangerous man learns to calculate risks systematically, understanding that avoiding all risks is itself a risky strategy, while taking calculated risks becomes a source of competitive advantage. Marcus's evolution in risk assessment became evident when his company faced a major technology transition. Management was migrating from legacy systems to a new platform, and they needed someone to lead the transition for his department. The assignment was politically dangerous as technology transitions frequently fail, and the person responsible typically becomes a scapegoat. Most of his colleagues actively avoided the assignment, recognizing its potential for career damage. However, Marcus approached the situation differently. He analyzed not just the obvious risks, but also the hidden opportunities. Yes, failure would be highly visible and damaging. But success would establish him as someone capable of managing complex, high-stakes projects. More importantly, he recognized that someone would inevitably be assigned to lead the transition, if not voluntarily, then by management mandate. By volunteering strategically, he could influence the terms and resources available for the project. Before accepting, he negotiated specific conditions: adequate budget allocation, direct access to senior management for escalation issues, and authority to build his own team. He also insisted on clearly defined success metrics and realistic timelines, protecting himself from arbitrary judgments about project performance. Most crucially, he documented all agreements and constraints, ensuring that any future evaluation would be based on objective criteria rather than political convenience. The risk assessment involved multiple layers of analysis. He evaluated the technical challenges, the political landscape within the company, the personal career implications, and the broader industry context. He identified potential allies and obstacles, developed contingency plans for likely problems, and established clear exit strategies if the project became unsalvageable. Machiavelli understood that fortune favors the bold, but only when boldness is combined with careful preparation and strategic thinking. The dangerous man doesn't avoid risks, he seeks out the right risks while minimizing unnecessary exposure to negative outcomes. This requires developing sophisticated judgment about probability, impact, and timing. The technology transition succeeded, largely because Marcus had anticipated most of the major obstacles and prepared solutions in advance. His systematic approach to risk management impressed senior leadership and established his reputation as someone capable of handling complex challenges. More importantly, it demonstrated his transformation from someone who feared uncertainty to someone who could navigate it strategically. The fourth sign, manipulation of social dynamics. The fourth transformation involves developing the ability to influence social dynamics subtly and effectively. This isn't about being manipulative in a petty or cruel sense, it's about understanding how social systems actually function and learning to work within those systems to achieve legitimate objectives. Machiavelli observed that all human interactions involve elements of influence and persuasion. The naive person operates under the illusion that pure merit and good intentions will naturally lead to positive outcomes. The dangerous man understands that social reality is constructed through complex interactions of personality, politics, timing, and strategic positioning. Marcus's development of social strategic awareness became apparent during the formation of a cross-departmental task force charged with improving company efficiency. Rather than simply contributing his expertise and hoping for the best, he began thinking systematically about the social dynamics that would determine the task force's actual effectiveness. He identified the informal power structures within the group who had real influence beyond their official titles, which personalities would naturally conflict, where the hidden agendas lay beneath the stated objectives. He recognized that the official task force leader, while competent, lacked the political skills to manage the competing interests involved. He also noted that several members had personal motivations that could either support or undermine the group's success. Instead of trying to dominate the group directly, Marcus positioned himself as a valuable resource to multiple factions. He built individual relationships with key members before group meetings, understanding their concerns and objectives. He learned to frame his contributions in terms that would appeal to different personalities and interests. When conflicts arose, he often suggested solutions that addressed underlying concerns rather than just surface disagreements. Most importantly, he began documenting and sharing the group's successes in ways that reflected well on all participants, building goodwill and encouraging continued cooperation. He understood that people support initiatives that make them look good and resist those that threaten their status or interests. The task force's recommendations were ultimately implemented successfully, largely because Marcus had helped manage the social dynamics that could have derailed the project. His approach wasn't about manipulation for selfish gain, it was about understanding human nature well enough to help groups function effectively despite their natural tendencies toward conflict and self-interest. Machiavelli emphasized that the prince must be both fox and lion, combining strategic cunning with decisive action. The social strategic awareness represents the fox aspect, understanding how to navigate complex human dynamics through intelligence and subtlety rather than force. This skill extends beyond formal work situations to all areas of life. In family dynamics, it means understanding how to address conflicts in ways that strengthen relationships rather than create lasting damage. In community involvement, it means knowing how to build coalitions and influence outcomes through persuasion rather than confrontation. In personal relationships, it means understanding what motivates people and learning to communicate in ways that inspire cooperation rather than resistance. The development of social strategic skills requires careful observation of human behavior, practice in reading social situations accurately, and the discipline to act on strategic understanding rather than emotional impulses. It means learning to see social interactions as complex systems rather than simple exchanges of information or emotion. The fourth sign represents a crucial transition from being acted upon by social forces to becoming an active agent in shaping social outcomes. This transformation is perhaps the most psychologically challenging because it requires abandoning comforting illusions about how the world should work in favor of understanding how it actually functions. As Marcus continued developing these capabilities, he began to notice a fundamental shift in how others perceived and interacted with him. Colleagues who had previously dismissed or ignored him began seeking his input on important decisions. Senior management started including him in strategic discussions that would have been closed to him previously. Most significantly, he found that he was no longer at the mercy of other people's decisions. He had become someone whose opinions and actions influenced outcomes. This transformation from victim to agent represents the essence of what Machiavelli understood about power and influence. The dangerous man is dangerous not because he seeks to harm others, but because he cannot be easily manipulated, controlled, or destroyed by external forces. He has developed the internal capabilities necessary to navigate complex realities while maintaining his integrity and advancing his legitimate interests. The first 4 signs: emotional detachment, strategic thinking, calculated risk assessment, and social dynamics manipulation, form the foundation of this transformation. They represent the development of sophisticated judgment, emotional discipline, and strategic awareness that distinguish reactive victims from strategic actors. However, the complete metamorphosis requires 3 additional transformations that build upon this foundation. The 5th, 6th, and 7th signs involve even more profound shifts in consciousness and capability, representing the full emergence of what Machiavelli would recognize as true personal sovereignty. Marcus was beginning to sense these deeper changes within himself, but their full implications were only starting to become apparent. The man who had once been vulnerable to every shift in corporate politics and social dynamics was discovering capabilities he hadn't known he possessed. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that this transformation was not just about professional success, it was about fundamental personal freedom and autonomy. The journey toward becoming what Machiavelli termed dangerous is ultimately a journey toward becoming undestroyable, not through aggression or dominance, but through the development of internal capabilities that make one immune to the manipulations and controls that keep most people in states of perpetual vulnerability and dependence. This metamorphosis challenges everything that conventional wisdom teaches about how to succeed and find happiness in life. It requires abandoning comfortable illusions about fairness, merit, and the essential goodness of human institutions. It demands the development of capabilities that most people prefer to avoid because they seem morally ambiguous or psychologically uncomfortable. Yet for those willing to undertake this transformation, the rewards extend far beyond mere professional advancement or social success. The dangerous man, in Machiavelli's conception, achieves something far more valuable: the ability to maintain his integrity and pursue his authentic objectives regardless of external circumstances or other people's agendas. The first 4 signs represent the beginning of this journey, the development of basic strategic awareness and emotional discipline. The remaining signs involve even more profound transformations that complete the metamorphosis from vulnerable victim to strategic sovereign. Understanding these deeper changes requires examining not just tactics and techniques, but fundamental shifts in consciousness and identity that represent the full flowering of human potential for strategic intelligence and personal autonomy. The conference room fell silent as Marcus finished presenting his analysis of the company's competitive position. 6 months earlier, such a presentation would have been met with polite acknowledgement and quick transition to other business. Today, the executive team sat in contemplative silence, absorbing implications they clearly hadn't considered. The shift in dynamics was subtle but unmistakable. He had evolved from someone who provided information to someone whose insights shaped strategic thinking. This transformation represented the emergence of the 5th sign of Machiavellian development, the ability to see and articulate patterns that remain invisible to others. But this was only the beginning of the deeper metamorphosis that would complete his evolution into what Machiavelli understood as truly dangerous: a man who could not be destroyed because he had already destroyed his weak self. The 5th sign, pattern recognition and strategic foresight. The 5th transformation involves developing the ability to perceive patterns and trends that escape ordinary observation. This goes beyond simple analytical skills to encompass a kind of strategic intuition that emerges from disciplined study of human nature, organizational dynamics, and systemic behavior. Marcus first noticed this developing capability during the quarterly budget planning process. While his colleagues focused on immediate departmental needs and obvious cost-cutting opportunities, he began seeing larger patterns in the company's resource allocation decisions. The real budget priorities weren't reflected in official statements about company strategy, they were embedded in subtle shifts in funding, personnel decisions, and project timelines. He recognized that the company was quietly preparing for a major strategic pivot, moving resources away from traditional product lines toward emerging technology sectors. The signs were scattered across dozens of seemingly unrelated decisions: hiring patterns in specific departments, vendor selection criteria for new contracts, the types of external consultants being engaged, even the topics emphasized in employee training programs. This pattern recognition allowed him to position himself strategically months before the official announcement. While others scrambled to adapt when the strategic shift was formally revealed, Marcus had already developed relevant expertise, built relationships with key personnel in the emerging focus areas, and prepared proposals that aligned with the company's new direction. Machiavelli emphasized that the successful prince must be able to anticipate changes in fortune and prepare accordingly. This requires developing what he called the eye of the mind, the ability to see beyond immediate appearances to underlying realities and emerging trends. The development of strategic foresight involves several interconnected capabilities. First, it requires learning to distinguish between what people say and what they actually do, recognizing that true intentions are revealed through patterns of behavior rather than official statements. Second, it involves understanding how different types of personalities and organizations typically respond to various pressures and opportunities. Third, it requires developing sensitivity to the subtle early indicators that precede major changes. Marcus began studying historical patterns in his industry, looking for recurring cycles and typical responses to common challenges. He learned to identify the early warning signs of organizational stress, market shifts, and leadership changes. Most importantly, he developed the discipline to act on his insights even when they contradicted conventional wisdom or popular opinion. This capability proved invaluable beyond immediate professional applications. In personal relationships, pattern recognition helped him understand recurring dynamics that had previously confused or frustrated him. In financial decisions, it allowed him to anticipate market trends and position himself advantageously. In life planning, it enabled him to prepare for likely challenges and opportunities before they became obvious to others. The dangerous man, in Machiavelli's conception, is dangerous precisely because he cannot be surprised or controlled through predictable manipulations. His ability to see patterns and anticipate changes makes him a strategic actor rather than a reactive victim. The sixth sign, emotional intelligence as tactical weapon. The sixth transformation involves the weaponization of emotional intelligence, not for malicious purposes, but as a sophisticated tool for understanding and influencing human behavior. This represents a crucial evolution from simple social awareness to strategic psychological competence. Traditional concepts of emotional intelligence focus on empathy, self-awareness, and social harmony. Machiavellian emotional intelligence incorporates these elements but extends them into strategic domains. The dangerous man understands not just how people feel, but how those feelings influence their decisions, what triggers specific emotional responses, and how emotional dynamics can be managed to achieve legitimate objectives. Marcus's development of this capability became apparent during a particularly challenging personnel situation. A talented team member had become increasingly disruptive, creating interpersonal conflicts that were affecting overall productivity. The employee's behavior seemed irrational and self-destructive, puzzling management and frustrating colleagues. Rather than simply addressing the surface behaviors, Marcus began investigating the underlying emotional dynamics. Through careful observation and strategic conversations, he discovered that the employee felt undervalued and overlooked for advancement opportunities. The disruptive behavior was an unconscious attempt to force recognition, even negative recognition, from leadership. Instead of confronting the behavior directly, Marcus orchestrated a series of interventions that addressed the underlying emotional needs while redirecting the destructive patterns. He arranged for the employee to receive more visible recognition for legitimate contributions, created opportunities for professional development that addressed the advancement concerns, and helped establish clearer communication channels with management. The transformation was remarkable. The previously disruptive employee became one of the team's strongest contributors, and the overall group dynamics improved significantly. Marcus had solved the problem not through confrontation or discipline, but through strategic application of psychological insight. Machiavelli understood that human behavior is driven primarily by emotional forces: fear, desire, pride, insecurity, ambition, even when people believe they're acting rationally. The dangerous man learns to read these emotional undercurrents accurately and responds to them strategically rather than just reacting to surface behaviors. This emotional strategic intelligence extends to understanding one's own psychological patterns as well. Marcus began recognizing his own emotional triggers and typical responses, learning to manage his reactions strategically rather than being controlled by unconscious patterns. He developed the ability to choose his emotional responses based on strategic considerations rather than automatic reactions. The weaponization of emotional intelligence involves several sophisticated capabilities. First, the ability to read emotional states accurately through subtle behavioral cues that most people miss or ignore. Second, understanding how different personality types typically process and respond to various emotional stimuli. Third, the skill of managing one's own emotional expression strategically to achieve specific responses from others. This doesn't mean becoming manipulative or deceptive, it means understanding the emotional dimensions of all human interactions and learning to work with those dynamics effectively. In negotiations, it means recognizing when someone's apparent rational objections are actually emotional resistance that needs to be addressed differently. In leadership situations, it means understanding how to inspire and motivate different personality types through approaches that resonate with their specific emotional patterns. The seventh sign, controlled ruthlessness. The final and most controversial transformation involves developing the capacity for what Machiavelli termed controlled ruthlessness, the ability to make difficult decisions and take hard actions when necessary, without being paralyzed by guilt, sentiment, or social pressure. This concept is frequently misunderstood as advocating cruelty or selfishness. In reality, Machiavellian ruthlessness is about developing the psychological strength to do what is necessary for legitimate objectives, even when those actions are emotionally difficult or socially unpopular. Marcus encountered this challenge when he was promoted to department manager and faced the need to address several long-term performance problems that previous managers had avoided. 3 employees were consistently underperforming, creating additional work for others and undermining team morale. Previous managers had tried various supportive interventions, additional training, modified responsibilities, increased supervision, without achieving meaningful improvement. The old Marcus would have continued these ineffective supportive approaches indefinitely, hoping that patience and encouragement would eventually produce results. The transformed Marcus recognized that prolonging the situation was actually cruel to everyone involved. The underperforming employees remained in positions where they couldn't succeed, the high-performing team members were penalized for others' inadequacies, and the department's overall effectiveness was compromised. He implemented a systematic performance improvement process with clear metrics, specific timelines, and explicit consequences. For 2 of the 3 employees, this clarity and structure provided the motivation and direction they needed to improve significantly. The 3rd employee, however, continued to underperform despite additional support and resources. Making the decision to terminate this employee's position was emotionally difficult, but Marcus recognized it as necessary for the well-being of the entire team. He handled the process professionally and compassionately, providing appropriate notice and support for transition, but he didn't allow sentiment or social pressure to prevent him from taking action that was clearly in everyone's long-term interests. Machiavelli argued that the prince who cannot act decisively when action is required will ultimately fail, causing greater suffering for everyone under his protection. The dangerous man develops the psychological strength to make difficult decisions based on strategic and ethical considerations rather than emotional comfort or social approval. This controlled ruthlessness extends beyond personnel decisions to all areas of life. It means being willing to end relationships that have become toxic or unproductive, even when doing so is emotionally painful. It means making financial decisions based on objective analysis rather than hope or sentiment. It means pursuing personal goals consistently even when others disapprove or when the path becomes challenging. The development of controlled ruthlessness requires distinguishing between necessary hardness and unnecessary cruelty. The dangerous man acts decisively when action is required, but he doesn't seek to cause harm for its own sake. His ruthlessness is always in service of legitimate objectives, personal integrity, organizational effectiveness, protection of those who depend on him, advancement of important principles. The integration of all 7 signs, the complete transformation into what Machiavelli would recognize as dangerous, involves the integration of all 7 capabilities into a coherent approach to life and leadership. These signs don't develop in isolation, they reinforce and amplify each other, creating a synergistic effect that represents far more than the sum of individual skills. Marcus began to experience this integration during a major crisis when his company faced potential acquisition by a larger competitor. The acquisition would likely result in significant layoffs, restructuring, and cultural changes. Most employees responded with anxiety, resignation, or desperate attempts to curry favor with potential new management. Marcus approached the situation differently, drawing on all 7 aspects of his transformation. He maintained emotional detachment from outcomes while working strategically to influence them. He used pattern recognition to understand the acquisition dynamics and anticipate likely scenarios. He applied social strategic skills to build alliances and position himself advantageously. He leveraged emotional intelligence to help manage team anxiety and maintain productivity during uncertainty. Most importantly, he demonstrated controlled ruthlessness by making difficult decisions about resource allocation and strategic priorities without being paralyzed by uncertainty or social pressure. When it became clear that certain projects would likely be discontinued regardless of the acquisition outcome, he redirected his team's efforts toward initiatives that would demonstrate value under any organizational structure. The result was that his department not only survived the acquisition intact but was actually expanded under the new management structure. His strategic approach during the crisis had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership capabilities the acquiring company valued. Several of his colleagues who had relied on traditional approaches, hoping for fairness, focusing solely on technical competence, or attempting to avoid difficult decisions, found themselves marginalized or eliminated during the transition. The philosophical foundation, destroying the weak self. The title concept, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, represents the ultimate objective of the Machiavellian transformation. This destruction is not about becoming cruel or abandoning moral principles. It's about systematically eliminating the psychological vulnerabilities that make one dependent on external circumstances for well-being, success, and identity. The weak self consists of several interconnected elements: the need for constant approval from others, attachment to specific outcomes beyond one's control, the illusion that the world operates according to fair and predictable principles, emotional reactivity that prevents strategic thinking, and the fantasy that good intentions automatically lead to positive results. Marcus recognized that his previous approach to life had been built on these vulnerable foundations. He had believed that working hard and being a good person would naturally lead to success and happiness. When this approach failed to deliver expected results, he had felt betrayed and confused, unable to understand why merit and virtue weren't sufficient for achievement and protection. The transformation process involved systematically replacing these vulnerable beliefs and behaviors with strategic capabilities. Instead of needing approval, he developed internal standards and the confidence to act according to his own judgment. Instead of being attached to specific outcomes, he learned to pursue objectives strategically while remaining flexible about methods and timelines. Instead of expecting fairness, he learned to understand and work with actual human nature and organizational dynamics. Most importantly, instead of relying on external circumstances for his sense of worth and security, he developed internal capabilities that allowed him to create value and protect his interests regardless of changing conditions. This transformation is profoundly liberating because it eliminates the constant anxiety and vulnerability that characterize most people's relationship with their environment. When your well-being and success depend entirely on factors beyond your control, other people's decisions, market conditions, organizational politics, social trends, you live in a state of perpetual insecurity and reactive dependence. The dangerous man, having destroyed his weak self, achieves a form of strategic independence. He can engage fully with the world and care deeply about outcomes while maintaining the psychological autonomy to adapt and thrive under any circumstances. He cannot be destroyed by others because he no longer possesses the psychological vulnerabilities that would allow such destruction. The ethical dimension. Critics of Machiavellian philosophy often argue that it advocates amoral or immoral behavior in pursuit of personal advantage. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of both Machiavelli's actual teachings and the transformation process he described. The dangerous man is not amoral, he has simply learned to be effective in an amoral world. His strategic capabilities allow him to protect and advance legitimate interests without being victimized by those who lack his scruples or strategic awareness. He can maintain his ethical principles precisely because he has developed the strength and competence to do so under adverse conditions. Marcus found that his transformation actually strengthened his ethical foundation rather than undermining it. When he had been weak and vulnerable, his good intentions had been ineffective and sometimes counterproductive. His attempts to help others had often failed because he lacked the strategic skills to navigate complex situations effectively. His commitment to fairness had been meaningless because he couldn't prevent unfair treatment of himself or others. As he developed strategic capabilities, his ability to act ethically increased dramatically. He could protect team members from unfair treatment because he understood organizational politics well enough to intervene effectively. He could maintain his integrity under pressure because he was no longer desperately dependent on others' approval. He could help others achieve their legitimate objectives because he had learned how to work with human nature rather than against it. The dangerous man's ethics are more robust than conventional morality because they're based on strength rather than weakness, competence rather than naivety, strategic awareness rather than wishful thinking. He can afford to be generous because he cannot be easily exploited. He can maintain his principles because he has the power to protect them. The continuing evolution, the transformation into a dangerous man, is not a destination but an ongoing process of development and refinement. Each of the 7 signs requires continuous practice and evolution as circumstances change and new challenges emerge. Marcus realized that his journey was far from complete. The capabilities he had developed were powerful but required constant maintenance and improvement. Emotional detachment needed to be balanced with appropriate engagement. Strategic thinking needed to incorporate new information and changing conditions. Risk assessment required updating based on evolving circumstances and accumulated experience. Most importantly, the integration of all 7 capabilities needed continuous refinement as he encountered more complex situations and higher levels of responsibility. The skills that had served him well as an individual contributor required adaptation and expansion as he took on leadership roles and broader organizational influence. The dangerous man never stops learning, never becomes complacent about his capabilities, never assumes that past success guarantees future results. His strategic awareness extends to understanding his own development needs and blind spots. His ruthlessness includes the willingness to abandon approaches that no longer serve him effectively. This commitment to continuous evolution is itself a form of strength. While others become attached to familiar patterns and resist necessary changes, the dangerous man embraces adaptation as a core competency. He remains dangerous precisely because he cannot be predicted or controlled through established patterns. He is always evolving, always learning, always becoming more sophisticated in his understanding and capabilities. The man who destroys his weak self achieves something far more valuable than conventional success or social approval. He achieves genuine freedom, the ability to pursue authentic objectives according to his own judgment, the strength to maintain his integrity under any circumstances, and the competence to protect and advance the interests of those he chooses to serve. This freedom comes at a price: the comfortable illusions that make most people's lives psychologically easier but strategically vulnerable. The dangerous man must live with clear-eyed awareness of how the world actually works, must take responsibility for his own results rather than blaming external circumstances, must develop capabilities that most people prefer to avoid because they seem morally ambiguous or psychologically demanding. But, for those willing to pay this price, the rewards extend far beyond personal advantage. The dangerous man becomes capable of genuine leadership, authentic relationships, and meaningful contribution to the world around him. He can afford to be generous, principled, and supportive because he possesses the strength and competence to maintain these qualities under adverse conditions. The final stage of this transformation involves understanding that true danger lies not in what one can do to others, but in what one has become immune to having done to oneself. The man who cannot be destroyed by others has achieved the ultimate form of personal sovereignty, not through dominance or aggression, but through the systematic development of internal capabilities that render external manipulation and control ineffective. This represents the completion of the metamorphosis from vulnerable victim to strategic sovereign, from reactive dependent to proactive agent, from weak self to dangerous man. The journey requires courage, discipline, and the willingness to abandon comfortable illusions in favor of strategic reality. But, for those who complete this transformation, the result is a form of freedom and capability that represents the full flowering of human potential for strategic intelligence and personal autonomy. 2 years after his metamorphosis began, Marcus stood before the board of directors presenting a strategic proposal that would reshape the company's future direction. The same executives who had once barely acknowledged his existence now sought his counsel on critical decisions. But this external recognition, while satisfying, paled in comparison to the internal transformation he had experienced. He had become fundamentally undestroyable, not through arrogance or aggression, but through the systematic development of capabilities that rendered him immune to the manipulations and controls that kept most people in states of perpetual vulnerability. The transformation from weak self to dangerous man represents more than personal development, it constitutes a fundamental shift in one's relationship with reality itself. Understanding this shift requires examining not just the practical applications of Machiavellian principles, but their deeper philosophical implications for human potential and authentic freedom. The paradox of strength through vulnerability. One of the most profound realizations in the advanced stages of Machiavellian development is that true strength often emerges through the conscious acknowledgement and strategic management of vulnerability rather than its denial or elimination. The dangerous man does not become invulnerable, he becomes strategically vulnerable, choosing when and how to reveal weakness in service of larger objectives. Marcus discovered this principle during negotiations for a major contract that could significantly impact his department's future. Traditional negotiation wisdom suggested projecting strength and confidence throughout the process. However, Marcus recognized that the client organization valued collaborative relationships and was suspicious of partners who seemed overly aggressive or self-serving. Instead of maintaining a facade of complete competence and control, he strategically revealed certain limitations and constraints his team faced. He discussed resource challenges honestly, acknowledged areas where his expertise was limited, and asked for the client's input on overcoming specific obstacles. This controlled vulnerability accomplished several strategic objectives simultaneously. First, it established authentic rapport with the client team, who appreciated working with someone who seemed genuine rather than calculating. Second, it encouraged the client to invest emotionally in solving shared problems rather than simply evaluating competing proposals. Third, it positioned Marcus as a collaborative partner rather than a vendor, creating a relationship dynamic that favored long-term cooperation over short-term advantage. The contract was awarded not to the team that projected the most confidence, but to the one that demonstrated the most authentic competence combined with strategic transparency about limitations. Marcus had learned that vulnerability, when deployed strategically, could be a more powerful tool than strength when projected defensively. This principle extends beyond professional negotiations to all areas of human interaction. In relationships, strategic vulnerability means being honest about personal limitations and growth areas while maintaining clear boundaries about what information to share and when. In leadership situations, it means acknowledging when decisions are difficult or uncertain while maintaining clear direction and accountability for results. The dangerous man learns to weaponize vulnerability not through manipulation or deception, but through authentic strategic disclosure that serves legitimate objectives while building genuine trust and cooperation. This represents a sophisticated evolution beyond simple strength or weakness toward strategic authenticity that achieves objectives while maintaining integrity. The integration of shadow and light. Advanced Machiavellian development requires confronting and integrating what Carl Jung termed the shadow, the aspects of personality and capability that conventional morality labels as negative or destructive. The dangerous man does not eliminate his capacity for hardness, calculation, or strategic deception. He learns to employ these capabilities ethically and effectively when circumstances require them. Marcus encountered this challenge when he discovered that a colleague was embezzling company funds through a sophisticated scheme that exploited accounting system vulnerabilities. The ethical response seemed clear: report the theft to management and cooperate with any investigation. However, the situation proved more complex upon deeper examination. The embezzling colleague was supporting an elderly parent with expensive medical treatments that insurance didn't cover. His financial situation had become desperate following a series of family crises, and he had initially taken small amounts intending to repay them before the scheme escalated beyond his control. Additionally, his immediate supervisor was creating a hostile work environment that had driven several employees to transfer or resign, suggesting that the colleague's ethical breakdown might be partially attributable to psychological pressure and desperation. A purely ethical response, immediate reporting, would likely result in criminal charges, job termination, and financial ruin for the colleague and his dependent parent. A purely pragmatic response, ignoring the theft, would allow continued criminal behavior and potential legal liability for the company. Marcus recognized that the situation required integrating both ethical and strategic considerations in a way that addressed all stakeholder interests effectively. He developed a complex intervention that demonstrated sophisticated moral reasoning combined with strategic execution. First, he privately confronted the colleague with documented evidence of the embezzlement, making it clear that continued theft was not an option but also expressing understanding of the underlying circumstances. Second, he helped the colleague develop a plan for making full restitution through legitimate means, including connecting him with employee assistance resources and helping him address the hostile supervision situation. Third, he monitored the situation closely to ensure compliance with the agreed resolution while also gathering evidence about the supervisory problems that had contributed to the ethical breakdown. When the colleague successfully completed restitution and demonstrated sustained ethical behavior, Marcus helped him transfer to a different department with better supervision. The hostile supervisor was subsequently reassigned following an investigation that revealed a pattern of inappropriate management practices. The intervention required capabilities that conventional morality might label as manipulative or deceptive: strategic information gathering, careful timing of disclosures, management of multiple stakeholders with competing interests, and the willingness to make complex judgments about competing ethical claims. However, the result served the legitimate interests of all parties while maintaining institutional integrity and preventing future problems. Machiavelli understood that effective leadership in complex situations requires the ability to employ the full spectrum of human capabilities, both constructive and destructive, in service of legitimate objectives. The dangerous man integrates his shadow not by becoming cruel or amoral, but by developing the sophisticated judgment necessary to employ difficult capabilities ethically when circumstances require them. The alchemy of power and service. The ultimate realization in Machiavellian development is that genuine power emerges not through domination or self-aggrandizement, but through the ability to serve larger purposes effectively. The dangerous man becomes dangerous to forces of chaos, incompetence, and malevolence precisely because he has developed the capabilities necessary to protect and advance what he values most. This transformation became clear to Marcus when he was offered a promotion to regional director, a position that would significantly increase his salary and status but require relocating and managing much larger teams across multiple locations. The old Marcus would have accepted immediately, viewing the promotion as validation of his worth and a natural next step in career advancement. Instead, he found himself evaluating the opportunity according to entirely different criteria. Would the new position allow him to have greater positive impact on outcomes he cared about? Would the challenges involved contribute to his continued development of capabilities that mattered to him? Would the role enable him to better serve the people and purposes he had chosen to support? After careful analysis, he realized that the promotion would actually distance him from the direct operational work he found most meaningful and satisfying. The regional director role was primarily administrative and political, requiring skills he had developed but work that didn't align with his authentic interests and values. More importantly, accepting the promotion would remove him from his current team at a critical juncture when his leadership and expertise were most needed for several important initiatives. He declined the promotion, recommending a colleague who was better suited to the administrative responsibilities and more interested in that career trajectory. His decision surprised many people who couldn't understand why someone would refuse such an obvious advancement opportunity. However, Marcus had learned to distinguish between external markers of success and authentic advancement of his own objectives. 6 months later, his strategic decision proved prescient. The company restructured the regional director positions, eliminating several roles and significantly reducing the authority and resources associated with the remaining positions. Meanwhile, Marcus's continued focus on operational excellence and team development resulted in his department being selected as a pilot program for innovative practices that were subsequently implemented company-wide. More importantly, his decision had been based on principles that transcended immediate career considerations. He had learned to evaluate opportunities according to their alignment with his authentic interests and values rather than conventional markers of achievement. He had developed the confidence to make decisions based on his own strategic judgment rather than social expectations or external pressure. The dangerous man exercises power not through position or authority, but through competence, integrity, and the ability to create value for purposes larger than himself. His danger lies not in what he might do for selfish advantage, but in his capacity to protect and advance what he has chosen to serve. The doctrine of proportional response. Advanced Machiavellian capability includes understanding the principle of proportional response, matching the intensity and method of intervention to the specific requirements of each situation. The dangerous man does not apply maximum force to every challenge, nor does he approach all situations with the same level of strategic complexity. Marcus learned this principle through a series of interpersonal conflicts that arose when his team expanded to include several new members with different work styles and cultural backgrounds. Initial attempts to manage these conflicts through standard diplomatic approaches proved ineffective. The underlying tensions continued to simmer and occasionally erupted into more serious disputes. Rather than applying increasingly intensive interventions, Marcus began analyzing each conflict according to its specific characteristics and requirements. Some disputes were based on genuine differences in professional judgment that could be resolved through better communication and clearer decision-making processes. Others stemmed from personality conflicts that required different seating arrangements and modified work assignments. A few involved deeper cultural misunderstandings that needed more comprehensive educational interventions. Most significantly, one conflict involved a team member whose behavior suggested potential mental health issues that were affecting work performance and group dynamics. This situation required a completely different approach, one that balanced compassion for the individual with responsibility for team effectiveness and compliance with company policies. Marcus developed tailored responses for each category of conflict, ranging from simple procedural adjustments to complex psychological interventions. The key insight was recognizing that effective leadership requires diagnostic sophistication, the ability to understand what type of problem you're actually dealing with before selecting intervention strategies. This principle applies beyond conflict management to all areas of strategic decision-making. Financial investments require different risk assessment approaches depending on time horizons, liquidity needs, and market conditions. Relationship challenges need different communication strategies based on personality types, cultural backgrounds, and the history of previous interactions. Career decisions demand different analytical frameworks depending on life stage, family circumstances, and long-term objectives. The dangerous man develops what might be called strategic sensitivity, the ability to calibrate his responses precisely to the requirements of specific situations rather than applying standard approaches regardless of context. This sophistication prevents both under-response, failing to address serious problems adequately, and over-response, using excessive force for minor issues. The philosophy of strategic patience. One of the most challenging aspects of advanced Machiavellian development is learning to operate with strategic patience, pursuing long-term objectives through sustained effort over extended time periods, even when immediate results are not visible or satisfying. The dangerous man learns to think in longer time horizons than most people can tolerate, planning and executing strategies that may not yield visible returns for years. Marcus encountered this challenge when he identified a significant opportunity to develop expertise in emerging technologies that would likely transform his industry within the next 5 to 10 years. However, developing this expertise would require significant time and resource investment with no guarantee of immediate career benefits, and possibly at the expense of short-term advancement opportunities in more established areas. The decision required weighing immediate versus long-term strategic considerations. Conventional career wisdom suggested focusing on skills and knowledge that would provide immediate advancement opportunities and visible results. However, Marcus's pattern recognition capabilities suggested that the industry transformation would create enormous opportunities for those who prepared adequately, while potentially making traditional expertise less valuable over time. He began a systematic program of skill development and relationship building in the emerging technology sector, allocating time and resources that could have been used for immediate career advancement. For the first 2 years, this investment showed no visible returns and actually slowed his progress in conventional terms. Colleagues who focused on immediate opportunities achieved faster promotions and recognition. However, when the industry transformation began accelerating in the 3rd year, Marcus found himself uniquely positioned to capitalize on new opportunities. His early investment in emerging technologies had given him expertise that suddenly became extremely valuable. The relationships he had built in the developing sector provided access to opportunities that weren't available to others. Most importantly, his strategic patience allowed him to influence the direction of changes rather than simply reacting to them. The dangerous man learns to operate with what might be called generational thinking, making decisions based on how they will position him for opportunities and challenges that may not emerge for years. This requires tremendous psychological discipline because it means accepting short-term sacrifices and delayed gratification for long-term strategic advantage. Strategic patience also involves understanding that many of the most important results in life emerge slowly through accumulated effects rather than dramatic single events. Building reputation, developing deep expertise, creating meaningful relationships, and establishing financial security all require sustained effort over time periods that exceed most people's attention spans and patience levels. The synthesis, becoming undestroyable, the complete transformation into what Machiavelli would recognize as dangerous, culminates in achieving a state that might be described as strategic invulnerability, not because one cannot be harmed, but because one has developed the capabilities necessary to adapt and thrive regardless of external circumstances. This invulnerability has several interconnected dimensions. Psychologically, it means developing internal sources of worth and satisfaction that cannot be destroyed by external events or other people's decisions. Professionally, it means building capabilities and relationships that provide options and resilience in changing economic conditions. Financially, it means creating multiple income sources and asset bases that provide security without dependence on any single employer or investment. Most importantly, it means developing the strategic intelligence and emotional discipline necessary to navigate complex challenges effectively regardless of their specific nature. The dangerous man becomes undestroyable not because he cannot fail, but because he can recover from any failure and learn from any setback. Marcus realized he had achieved this state during a company-wide crisis when economic downturns forced massive layoffs and restructuring. While many colleagues experienced the crisis as a catastrophic threat to their security and identity, Marcus found himself viewing it as a complex strategic challenge that required careful analysis and adaptive response. His diverse skill set, broad relationship network, and financial preparation provided multiple options for maintaining security regardless of what happened to his current position. His emotional discipline prevented panic or desperate decision-making. His strategic thinking capabilities allowed him to identify opportunities that others missed while they focused on threats and losses. Most importantly, his internal sense of worth and purpose remained stable despite external chaos. He had learned to derive satisfaction and identity from his capabilities and principles rather than external circumstances or other people's recognition. This psychological independence allowed him to make strategic decisions based on objective analysis rather than emotional reactions to uncertainty. The crisis ultimately resulted in increased responsibilities and influence for Marcus as leadership recognized his value during difficult times. However, his response to the crisis hadn't been motivated by desire for advancement, it had emerged naturally from the capabilities and attitudes he had developed through his transformation process. The responsibility of power. The final aspect of becoming dangerous in the Machiavellian sense involves understanding that genuine power creates genuine responsibility. The man who cannot be destroyed by others becomes someone upon whom others depend for protection and guidance. This responsibility represents both the ultimate test and the ultimate purpose of the transformation process. Marcus discovered this responsibility as colleagues and team members began seeking his guidance on increasingly complex personal and professional challenges. People who had previously viewed him as a peer began treating him as a mentor and advisor. His opinions carried more weight in discussions, his recommendations influenced important decisions, and his support became valuable currency in organizational politics. This influence brought awareness that his actions and decisions now affected not just his own outcomes, but the opportunities and security of others who had come to depend on his judgment and protection. The capabilities he had developed for his own strategic advantage now served a larger purpose, enabling him to protect and advance the interests of people who lacked his strategic sophistication or positional power. The dangerous man learns that true power is not the ability to get what you want, but the ability to ensure that what you want aligns with larger purposes worthy of the capabilities you have developed. His transformation from weak self to strategic sovereign is complete only when he becomes a guardian of values and people that matter more than his individual advancement. This guardianship represents the ethical culmination of Machiavellian development. The strategic capabilities that could be used for selfish manipulation become tools for protecting others from exploitation and creating opportunities for mutual flourishing. The emotional discipline that could enable callous calculation becomes the foundation for making difficult decisions that serve collective interests even when they require personal sacrifice. The man who destroys his weak self becomes dangerous not to innocent people pursuing legitimate interests, but to forces of chaos, incompetence, and malevolence that threaten what he has chosen to protect. His danger lies in his incorruptibility, his strategic competence, and his commitment to purposes larger than himself. The legacy of transformation. The ultimate measure of Machiavellian transformation is not personal achievement or individual invulnerability, but the lasting impact on others and institutions. The dangerous man becomes a force for positive change not through idealistic hopes or moral exhortations, but through practical competence in understanding and improving how things actually work. Marcus began to see this legacy effect as people he had mentored and protected began developing their own strategic capabilities. The team culture he had helped create emphasized competence over politics, strategic thinking over emotional reactions, and collective success over individual advancement. New employees learned to approach challenges systematically rather than reactively, to build capabilities rather than depend on circumstances, to take responsibility for results rather than blame external factors. More importantly, the organizational improvements he had helped implement began creating positive outcomes that extended far beyond his immediate sphere of influence. Better decision-making processes reduced waste and improved customer satisfaction. More effective conflict resolution methods decreased employee turnover and increased productivity. Strategic planning that incorporated longer time horizons and more sophisticated analysis led to sustainable competitive advantages. The dangerous man's legacy is measured not by monuments to his own achievement, but by the improved functioning of systems and the enhanced capabilities of people who learn from his example. His transformation from victim to sovereign creates ripple effects that strengthen institutions and develop others' capacity for strategic thinking and effective action. Conclusion: the eternal paradox. The journey from weak self to dangerous man reveals a fundamental paradox about power and vulnerability that Machiavelli understood intuitively but never fully articulated. The man who becomes truly undestroyable does so not by eliminating vulnerability, but by transforming it into strategic advantage. He becomes dangerous not through capacity for harm, but through immunity to the fears and dependencies that control most people's behavior. This transformation is simultaneously personal and transpersonal, individual and collective, practical and philosophical. It represents the full development of human potential for strategic intelligence and authentic autonomy, but it achieves its ultimate purpose only when deployed in service of values and people beyond the individual self. The 7 signs: emotional detachment, strategic thinking, risk assessment, social dynamics manipulation, pattern recognition, emotional intelligence weaponization, and controlled ruthlessness form an integrated system of capabilities that enables this transformation. But their development is worthless unless it serves purposes worthy of the effort required and the responsibilities created. Marcus had become dangerous in exactly the way Machiavelli envisioned, not as a threat to innocent people or legitimate institutions, but as an incorruptible guardian of what he had chosen to protect and advance. He could not be destroyed by others because he had destroyed the psychological vulnerabilities that made such destruction possible. But, more importantly, he had become someone whose strength enabled others to flourish rather than merely surviving in a hostile environment. The man who destroys his weak self achieves the ultimate form of personal freedom, not the freedom to do whatever he wants, but the freedom to pursue what truly matters regardless of external obstacles or opposition. This freedom, earned through disciplined development of sophisticated capabilities, represents both the reward and the responsibility of the Machiavellian transformation. In the end, the dangerous man is dangerous primarily to himself, to his own comfort, complacency, and convenient illusions about how the world works. But, through this creative self-destruction, he becomes capable of creating value, protecting others, and advancing purposes that justify the considerable effort required to achieve such capabilities. The transformation from weak self to dangerous man is ultimately a transformation from victim to creator, from dependent to sovereign, from reactor to agent. It represents the full flowering of human potential for strategic intelligence, authentic autonomy, and meaningful contribution to the world. For those willing to undertake this challenging journey, the rewards extend far beyond personal advantage to encompass the ability to serve purposes worthy of the capabilities developed through disciplined self-destruction and conscious reconstruction.